I'm really delighted to have a chance to be the guinea pig for this, and I hope that at least somebody is out there in internet world taking part in this with me. The idea for today is for me to share some ideas I have about why we should study strategist practice and what it adds to our understanding of strategy. And I'm going to do that with some reference to myself and some of the work that I and my colleagues have done. For some of you who maybe know a great deal about strategy as practice already, you may feel that some of this you already understand, but hopefully it'll still be valuable to you to recap some of that and understand that I still believe those things are a valuable area for our field. And for those of you who are perhaps a little newer to the field, it should hopefully give you some insights into why I believe this is an important area of study and how it complements our understanding of strategy generally. To do this, I'm going to use a slide pack and talk you through those. Unfortunately, the technology doesn't let you see my face and my slides. So we'll move on to my slides and then I will make some, I'll come back online so you can see my face towards the end. You should feel free to post comments or questions whenever you want. I'll be able to see those questions coming up through the help of our trusty facilitator, and I'll try and answer those as and when I can as the session's going on. I don't know if I've introduced myself, but just in case you don't know who I am, I'm Paula Jarzabkowski. I'm a professor of strategic management at Cass Business School and also at the University of Queensland Business School. And I think I'm a founder and one of the pioneers in the strategy as practice field. So nice to meet you. Let's get started on some things that I think are important. I'm just going to start to share a screen with you. Well, I think I'm going to do that. Just give me a moment. That's my plan. Okay. You should see my screen now and my slides. Okay, so strategy as practice, some people may ask you, well, what is that thing? Is it a theory? It's not exactly a theory. It's more a research field and a lens and an approach, and that's what I'm going to talk you through today. It is definitely a research field. When I started in this area, there wasn't a body or a corpus of work in this area, and the terms like strategizing and so forth weren't common terms to use. But now increasingly it's understood as a research field. You know, we have our own interest groups and our own conference tracks. There's been key articles in all of the leading journals and an annals piece. We've got lots of special issues in, again, most of the FT50 list. We've got books from a monograph to handbooks, and we've got dedicated streams and tracks at a number of the key conferences, as well as, and I always think you know when you're successful when people are criticising you. And indeed, we've been criticised in various places for the things that we neglect, some of which I'll try to top off, some of which I'll try to touch on as part of what I'm talking about. I've just had a question come in, and there's a few questions coming in. I probably won't try to deal with all of those as they come in because there might be too many and it might disrupt. So just to let you know, if you are sending questions, I am seeing those, but I'll do a little bit of talking, and it may be that in talking about these slides, some of that will already answer some of the questions that you have as we go through. Just to say a little bit about who am I and what do I believe in, to put what I'm talking to you about in context, I want to push the envelope theoretically in terms of what we can do with strategy as practice. And so in that sense, I want to really understand how we can look at both the micro practices that people do in their everyday work, but also to understand how that messy everyday practice is theoretically important in explaining what strategy is, what organizations are, and how big a phenomena, even like how markets react. As part of that, I've written lots of papers, big pieces that are in some of the key journals, but also some theoretical pieces and some methodological pieces, as well as some books. That should give you a bit of a feel for where I come from. In particular, I'm interested in doing ethnographic work. So I've done a lot of fellowships where I've done audio and video ethnography. And my most recent ambition is to take seriously the call in, you may be aware of a 2014 paper on strategy as practice by Seidel and Whittington. in organisation studies, where they encourage us to take flatter ontologies and explain how the micro constitutes the macro. That's very much my aim at the moment. And I think that I was quite successful with that in a book that we wrote, where we use the micro practices of people who are trading deals in their offices all around the world to explain the way an entire market works. And you can read more about that in this book, or actually one of the papers in the Strategic Management Journal special issue in 2018, we show how we use practices to explain the competitive dynamics of a market. So in that sense, gives you a little bit of an idea of where I come from, and that I'm trying to really take this work at the most cutting edge. I've got a few questions here, so I'm just going to quickly deal with those and then go on to why strategy is practice. So some of the questions are, what is one field of SAP you recommend if I chose SAP approach for my thesis? Another is it wrong to have practices, praxis, and practitioners as categories of analysis? And another is there strategizing in every strategic practice? I think I can take all of those at once to say that SAP, there isn't a field of SAP per se, as in a bunch of different fields. Strategy is practice, which is what I'm about to explain in this particular session. So if you hang with me through the session, take time to absorb what I'm saying here. This is what the field is about. And you don't need to have practices, praxis, and practitioners are like an overview of the perspective. They're not actually analytic categories, and you should, so indeed, you wouldn't need to have each of those as one category in your analysis. They are more an overall perspective, and then you still need to drill down into some specific types of things within any one of those, and that would be where you'd be looking for what is the strategizing within this practice, or how are these practitioners strategizing? So just to answer those questions, I think those three questions go together quite nicely, and hopefully this presentation will help you to better understand some of those points. So the first thing I think is I'm going to take you on a bit of a selective historical tour of why use strategy as practice. And so in that sense, I think it's important to understand the history or the background to where strategy as practice came from as a field. And if you want to read a little bit more about this, there's a Journal of Management Inquiry 2008 dialogue between myself, Joe Bauer, myself and Richard Whittington as the strategy as practice people, Joe Bauer from the Harvard School, and Rob Grant from economics, talking about the different contributions those have all had to the field of strategy. Okay, so let's start with the notion that initially we had sort of what was called the Harvard School approach, and you'll be aware of the case studies. And strategy at that time, when it was being taught, was very much about the general manager as a strategist, and they would bring people in who'd been successful in their companies, get them to talk about what they did, and that's very much the origin of the case approach and how we tended to think of strategists as some important people in a company and how they, did strategy. But of course, the criticisms of that was quite atheoretical, and so economics was posed as a more theoretical approach. We didn't just want these empirical stories. And so the sorts of things, and this is what Joe Bauer says, that of course that was helpful in bringing some sort of theoretical rigor, but as the specific theory that we had in place, which was an economic theory, came in, managers began to disappear, and more often the question was about companies, with the people inside the company serving as a proxy for the company. And so we lost sight of people doing things and became much more about the unit of analysis as firms. And because a firm in and of itself is difficult to observe doing things, researchers move more to an economics-focused sort of quantitative view of strategy. And that is indeed much of the origin of, for example, the Strategic Management Journal. The problem, of course, of some of these types of things is that when we only take one type of a lens or approach to strategy, we do get particular types of rules of behaviour being prescribed, but these may be normative, but not necessarily reflecting actual practice. And so it was necessary to then swing the balance back, and strategy as practice really is where I think we've taken on that challenge. So strategy as practice is not atheoretical. It's not just about, what do people do? It's actually underpinned by social theories of practice or sociological theories. So these might be things like Giddens, Bourdieu, Shatsky. You would have heard of some of these theories. And so there's a theoretical basis to strategy as practice that complements the strategy, what types of theories you get in economics. So if you think about economics as being focused on sort of parsimonious theories that are generalizable, so simple with a few variables that we can generalize to a mass population, the types of theories we're talking about here, given the three tests of theory are simplicity, generalizability, and accuracy, we're talking more about theories that are high in accuracy because they can really reflect how things are done in particular contexts. So as part of that, initially we got this view of strategy as practice as micro-strategizing. I'm going to talk later about dispelling the myth of micro versus macro, but that came about as a kind of chance to redress the focus on the firm and to say, actually, we need to go from the firm to looking inside and at what people are actually doing and to differentiate the first special issue called that micro-strategizing, and it very much focused on the internal dynamics of what people do in making strategies. So it was aligned to the strategy process movement that was already in place, but also giving more focus and impetus to that around what we should look at. So now what I want to talk about is that there are two methodological premises that you need to be aware of when you're thinking about how to do strategy as practice research. And the first one is, and for those of you who have sent me some questions about, what is practice, what are practices and so forth, I like to use this as a way to think about it and to give you some definitions. So the next couple of slides will help to answer that question for those of you who put that question up. So first, I think we need to understand that when we look at what people are doing, they are doing things in the moment. They are doing practices, things that they are doing, but also these things that are happening in the moment are unfolding over time. Okay, so they are at any moment that you're observing people, if you're doing an ethnography, for example, then you would be observing them doing things in the moment, but you're not observing them just for the purposes of the moment, but to understand how that constructs some broader thing over time. So what we might call what is becoming or being constructed within all of these moments. We could call that the process. We could call that the stream of praxis. So those of you who are interested in what's the difference between practices and praxis, then what people are doing and how that unfolds over time might give you some ways to hook into that. And the phenomena that we're studying because of this are going to be temporary, precarious, unfolding, influx, unintended, emerging. And these are hard things to study because you have to actually watch them unfolding over time. And so that's, sort of worth thinking about, that this methodological premise is actually quite critical to our understanding of what is strategy as practice. So what is this practice theoretical underpinning that I talk about? And if you've read the Whittington article in Organisation Studies in 2006, you'll be aware that he refers to a sociological eye. So that's really the theoretical underpinning that we're bringing to what people are doing. And I tend to, increasingly, I enjoy the work of Shatsky, and I also love the way that Davide Niccolini has interpreted some of these different practice theories to help us understand, for those of you who are interested in what should I look at when I'm trying, what sort of data should I gather, what kinds of things am I looking at? Well, if you want to follow practices, you're interested in people's doings and sayings, so what people are doing and saying and how they're connected over time. As part of that, you could be looking at doings and sayings in, one part of a case study and connecting them to other parts, in one group of people and connecting to other groups, in one set of meetings and then connecting them to other subsequent meetings. So, for example, you might watch a strategic planning process and follow the doings and sayings across a series of connected meetings within which that strategic planning is being done. And you might also try to look at what spans time and space. So, for example, the documents that they create or the sorts of maybe the visual aids that they create that they draw upon in multiple types of these meetings. What we're assuming is that people are knowledgeable, so practitioners are knowledgeable performers of their everyday work. Okay, so we are knowledgeable about what we do. And when we look at these strategy, these sort of practices over time, we understand that this is what we're actually trying to understand, the knowledgeable performance by actors of their strategies. So then as you take a corpus of those, so a single meeting won't tell you enough, but as you take a corpus of those, you'll begin to understand what are the patterned things people do that are the practices that collectively constitute what I'm trying to study, which could be the strategic planning process, which could be the firm's strategy, which could be the organization, which could be the industry. So in that sense, this is where these types of things are coming from. We're looking at what people are doing, not just to say they do this, but to say that because they do this in these ways, it constructs their strategy in this particular way. And so from that perspective, we can say that if we want to understand a firm's strategy or a competition in an industry or the way a market works, that we can theorize and study that from the nexus of practices of the individuals who are doing things. But to do that, we're going to need to study a fair few relevant individuals doing those things and join them up or connect them. And this is the point of the nexus of interconnectedness, in order to understand how those doings make the strategy the way that it is. Some of you are asking some pretty specific questions at the moment about like specific papers of mine and so forth. I think that it probably wouldn't be really appropriate to try and answer those, in so much as I want to give an oversight to everybody here about strategist practice and what it does to the field of strategy and how we study it. But I would hope that once I've done that, that it will also help you understand some of the things that might be in some of my specific papers. And yes, I can share the slides after this presentation, so don't worry about that. This will actually be a video that you can revisit any time, so the slides will be on there. Okay, so how do we study it? Some of you have asked that question. So one of the questions is it a fly-on-the-wall approach? Do we need to be ethnographers? I tend to like to do ethnography. That said, it's not absolutely essential to do ethnography or observation in order to study strategist practice. You can also ask people questions and do in-depth interviewing about their practices. You can collect documents that are written at the moment in time. For example, if you can get the minutes of meetings that people have taken at a moment in time, those will be sort of tangible material traces of what they were doing at that time. And then you can construct a retrospective story around that and ask people what they understood about it. So in that sense, you can do strategy as practice through retrospective interviewing and documents. You can also collect the types of the videos and things that people increasingly now create. But of course, I do tend to like observing people doing things. And I tend to think that this is what we call a naturally occurring experiment. So people, when they're actually doing things in the wild, okay, so actually acting as they do in their natural situations, they are experimenting with their everyday practice. So right now we're experimenting on using this format to present research, for example, and for you to meet me and for me to know something about you from your questions. It's a naturally occurring experiment, and we could observe that and try to understand something from it. So interviews and ethnography are quite typical methods. And as I said, ethnographic methods tend to privilege behaviour in the wild. So if we're really interested in how what people do constructs the sort of social environment within which that doing makes sense, then ethnography is one of the methods by which we can actually situate people within the environment that they are constructing. So we watch them doing and know that that doing creates the strategy that they are making or the way that they organise and so forth. Okay, of course, the thing is that you will then collect a large amount of data, lots and lots of observations. You'll sit in loads of meetings. As you possibly know, if you've followed any of my work, my largest study was global ethnography of the reinsurance industry over 3 years, and we had something like over 900 observations of sitting beside people while they traded deals, following them to dinners and so forth. So you get a lot of data when you do ethnography. And what is it that you should do with that data? How do you actually analyse it? So I'm going to show you some thoughts. I mean, you can actually turn it into a series of units of data. And this is something that sometimes people do. I'm going to talk about what I think about that, but just have a look at this first. So in a study that I did with Jane Lee, for 2 years, we observed these meetings in a company that were across all the divisions of a 90,000 person company. And we observed these meetings around a specific phenomena that was going on, a strategic change that was going on. And we noticed that there was a lot of laughter in the meetings. So we never set out to study laughter. We had actually expected to be this a very tense situation. It was a very fraught and problematic regulatory change. And without a doubt, it was tense, but we also noticed this laughter. So that was a clue to us that laughter is an important practice in some way for these people. So we began to take notes on the laughter. And later on, we had the 86 key meetings conducted at the corporate centre, transcribed in terms of every incident of humour within them. Now, once you've got every single incident of humour in 86 meetings over 2 years, then you've got a lot of units of data. Now, you can, and it is tempting to just quantitatively reduce these. So, for example, you can see that we did, in fact, do that, like how many humour events are there, as in how many times do people laugh in every quarter of the meeting. And that is something you can do since you've already got all that data. And but the question you have to ask yourself is, why would I do that? What would that actually explain to quantify laughter? Am I trying to say more laughter creates something? Is there a reason for the frequency count? Will frequency show me anything? Or will frequency in different parts of the meeting, such as this, where once we summed it up and averaged it, we see, oh, well, people laugh more at the start of a meeting and people laugh more at the end of a meeting than they do in the middle of a meeting, although is that statistically significant? You'd have to do some analysis. But the point is, why again would I want to do that? Laughter may be a human doing, a practice, an emotional practice of some sort, to laugh, to show humour. But what am I trying to explain? What is the praxis, the flow, the strategy, the something that I'm trying to explain? And quite frankly, I can't see anything that would explain other than perhaps laughter as some sort of bonding mechanism. So in that sense, sometimes people get a bit confused about, why am I studying all this doing? It's not just to show what doing is, it's actually to explain something that is puzzling us already in organisation theory or in strategy. And that's the thing you've got to do. You've got to tie these data that you collect into wanting to explain some problem or phenomena of interest that we would like to know more about. This is the sort of thing we actually then did. We went back and looked at the content. What is going on in the humour and what does this humour relate to? So these are the kinds of ways we transcribed the data. And so we're actually, so what's a little bit of the context you can see in there in the first few lines of this slide. And then you can get some idea of how people are laughing and about what. And what you're actually seeing in this, and this became critical to us, we started to understand, and that was the main value in having actually transcribed and quantified all of that data on how much laughter and about what, is we realized that 58% of all the laughter was to do with this very paradoxical and highly tense situation that they faced. In other words, laughter was somehow important and connected as a practice to resolving the paradoxes or addressing the paradoxes and tensions that they faced in this major change. We could show that, and these were the kinds of things. If, for example, here, they're going to have red status, which means something is at risk, it's going to be really problematic, and yet, as you see, they're laughing about that. In other words, laughter is doing something in the context of problematic strategic changes. And what we actually end up doing over time, then as we theorize about that and we really drill down into those incidences that in the moment that I talked about earlier, as we drill down into those incidences, we understand that humour both constructs for them a paradox. Humour signals to them that there is a paradox here, something that is illogical or inconsistent that we have to manage. So it constructs it and then it enables to make a response. And as we traced multiple incidences of humour, we understood that actually it has two different paths. It can either entrench and so support them being quite resistant to specific changes, or depending on the way that the laughter constructs the paradox, it could actually enable shifting through these paradoxes. And so that gives you some idea of how you go deeper inside the skin of what people are doing in the moment to help understand what it explains about the more wider process that you're trying to study. And that's the interaction, if you want, between the practices of humor making as a doing, and the overarching praxis of this unfolding strategic change. Okay, so let's talk about why that's important. Why do we need to know that? Because it's not much point just to do this to say, well, because it's micro. Because it's micro, it doesn't mean anything. So A, is it micro? We'll discuss that shortly. But even if it is micro, it's only of value if it shows us something we didn't know in existing theory. Okay, so is there something about existing theories of strategic change or how firms compete or strategic planning or something like that that is not explained? But if you take this practice lens, you will show us something that we didn't know. So remember, that's your aim when you're doing strategy as practice research, that by drilling down into what people do in the moment and showing how it constructs specific patterns over time and processes over time, you're showing us something theoretically we couldn't know about how or why firms do what they do. So what we're first of all trying to do, though, is often the reason you can't access this stuff just by looking at documents or interviewing people or from secondary data is because a lot of this stuff is taken for granted, and you need to surface the taken for granted in order to understand what effect it has. And people can't tell you about what is taken for granted because it's taken for granted. So, for example, had I gone to those people facing a high-risk regulatory strategic change and said to them, look, what's really important here and what do you do when you face really challenging problems where your company's liable to face a major fine in the, tens of thousands of pounds? Well, they would never have said to me, we laugh a lot, right? Because they wouldn't have known they laugh a lot, and it would have seemed like a flippant remark to make. It's necessary, therefore, for me to think this laughter seems important because they do it a lot, although they are unaware of it. So you surface the taken for granted. That thing which is familiar, you have to make strange. You have to say, well, why is it so? What's going on here? You need to sort of make it strange by theorizing about it. What is going on? So you surface it and you make it strange through the way that you theorize about it. Part of the reason that this is so important is it actually enlightens us to these things that seem very mundane or that seem very unimportant and that nobody ever talks about and yet are very, very consequential. And when I say the danger of hagiographies, the reason I use that is hagiographies are the lives of saints, okay? So when we do a hagiography, we find out what is good that made somebody a saint. And too much of what we look at when we look at strategies in organizations is, hagiographies. We try to look for what was excellent that made them so successful. And in doing that, we're actually often overlooking maybe some taken for granted things they don't even know themselves that they do, and that are, in fact, very important. And what I'm talking about here is the importance of the mundane. It is in the mundane everyday practice that we see how any organization constitutes what is either its successes or its failures, rather than looking for some kind of significant outlier that must be the special thing. And to give you an idea of this, I want to introduce you to an article that was very instructive and informative for me when I first read it, and continues to be so. It's a paper by an anthropologist, and it's called The Mundanity of Excellence. And this anthropologist actually looked at swimmers, okay? So he looked at swimmers at different levels, from club level swimmers through to Olympic swimmers, from the premise that Olympic swimmers are clearly the excellent swimmers. Yeah? So, we have already a criteria of excellence that's reasonably uncontestable, which I think is much harder in firms, because even if you think a firm is excellent, you very often find out 5 years later that it was fraudulent or that it overstretched its boundaries. And so in that sense, at least if we look at these Olympic swimmers, we know that they're the excellent ones, and he wanted to understand what is it in their everyday practice that is different. What is it that makes them excellent? And what he found is that actually Olympic swimmers and club level swimmers are, for a start, not physically enormously different. It's not like there's some amazing biological or physiological features that make the difference. There may be some, but that's not the key distinctive thing. And actually that they all do the same types of activities. But the difference with the Olympic ones is that they drill these dozens of small activities into habit. So they always do the tumble turn, they always correct the tumble turn, they always turn up for practice on time, they always get the proper sleep, eat the right nutrition. And it is this which produces the excellence, that not that they do different activities, but that they do all the same small activities, but they really drill each one of those into something perfect that they string together. So each and every one of those actions in and of itself is a small, taken for granted, mundane thing that everybody does, but they do it consistently together over and over until it produces the pattern that is excellent. And I think this is a really important thing for us to focus on. And indeed, for one of you who's just sent a question about, could you use this to convince a company to open their processes? Yes, absolutely. To let them know that the taken for granted that they themselves don't know could be the secret to either the problems that they're facing and their inertias because they don't see them, or indeed could be some of the critical things that they're doing well that will be absolutely important for them not to lose during change. And so, when we think about that excellence resides within many mundane patterns, it's something that we can say, if we want to change or sustain critical habits, we first need to know what they are. And so we need to surface the taken for granted. And it's difficult for you as somebody to tell me what is taken for granted by you because it's taken for granted. And so you don't know that you do it. So hopefully that answers that question, but also gives you an understanding of what it is we're aiming to explain through this approach. So some of you have asked me questions about, well, what are practices? I get confused about these things. I tend to think you don't want to get too hung up on that, okay? So don't get too hung up on, is it a practice or is it a praxis, or, it depends a little bit on what it is you're studying. What is the phenomena and the level of analysis for you that will let you know what are the practices and actions for you. But let me talk about some of the ways I've tried to deal with that myself to help you understand better how you might deal with it in your own data. So one of the questions we need first of all is to know, well, what are people actually doing? Okay, so laughter became one important doing in that study I just explained to you. Now, laughter won't always be the case. People will always be laughing, but that might not be the thing that catches your attention. So it's what is it that are actions that catch your attention that seem to explain something and that is important. So I'm going to show you how I've described and explained some actions and practices. You should look at some other strategy as practice papers as well, empirical ones, and look at what specific things they talk about. They might talk about social practices of interaction. That's the Balogun and Johnson paper in 2005. And they actually tell you what they mean by that, which are lateral practices of interaction across divisions. If you look at my 2008 AMJ, I describe very clearly sorts of actions about people allocating resources, developing budget plans, developing performance targets. Those are the actions I'm interested in one type of strategizing. I differentiate between types of strategizing according to those actions. But as you can see, there's no one category for actions. That's the actions that are relevant to the strategizing I was studying. Social practices of interaction across divisions were relevant to the sense-making of divisional actors in Julia's study, for example. So it's not like there's one set of actions and you should be looking for those. You should be looking for the actions that explain something that you want to explain in your study. And so let me show you, and if you can see this slide, go with me on this one because I think it's quite interesting, because you initially look at like some specific actions and then you sort of cluster those actions to try and understand what are those actions doing in shaping work. This is from our study of Lloyd's of London, and it's a 2015 paper. And so we initially, the taken for granted that surprised us here is we were studying a trading floor, and we noticed that when people were sitting in their offices, which are distributed around the trading floor, so nowhere near it, sort of they have to actually leave their building and walk to the trading floor, that at around 10:30, all around in these buildings, it didn't seem to matter which one you were in and observing, people would start putting on a tie, rolling down their sleeves, putting on their coat. And it was kind of spontaneous. Nobody said, this is time to do that. Nobody said, oh, you're going to the market, you need to put on your tie. It was just sort of a taken for granted thing they did. And we sort of found this very funny at first. It was for them, it was taken for granted. For us, their familiarity was strange. And then we decided to make it strange, because we decided to say, well, why do they do that? What is doing that dressing doing, and what else might they be doing? Because we thought, well, it's differentiating. Yeah, it's differentiating between their office, where they sit there with their sleeves up, no tie and relaxed, and when they go to the trading floor. So something there is a differentiation for them, because really it's the same person on the trading floor or in the office. So it doesn't matter what they're wearing. Surely it's doing something else. And we then began to look at all these other practices. What stuff do they do? Generating loss curves, calculating financial terms, having gossip, sharing gossip, having lunch, doing these things. And we clustered these practices according to where they did them, so in their offices or on the trading floor. And then we clustered them more into things about, well, what did that seem to be doing? Were there analytic practices? Were they social practices? Gossip, lunch, these are kind of social practices, whereas sort of loss curves or financial returns are analytic practices. And we thought, well, are they doing those things in different places? And we found that often some actions cluster to one part of their work and other actions cluster to another part of their work. In other words, these kinds of actions construct different types of work in different spaces. And that allows them in their offices to construct themselves as competitors, and yet when they are on the trading floors to construct themselves as collaborators in creating a market. And so you can see how we started with some things that may, felt strange, although they were familiar to them and that they wouldn't have been able to describe. And then we began to describe a lot of practices and then demarcate, where do those practices happen? Why are they happening there and not here? What is it doing? We began to theorize about them and make them strange. And in doing so, we began to understand that what this does is help them to work between two ostensibly contradictory logics in ways that were quite normal and comfortable for them. So I hope that this kind of thing gives you some ideas about, if we go back to my previous question, what might be practices and actions in your research? Go back and look at what sorts of things have piqued your attention, or you found, wow, that's interesting. You've tried to bore your partner or your friends by saying, oh, it was so interesting when I was in the field today. And they're looking at you like, why is it so interesting that people were laughing? Or why is it so interesting that people were putting on ties? But you've got a hunch, you've got a gut feel that there's something about this that is interesting, and I need to work out what it is. And clearly, I'm not developing a theory of tie, am I? I'm developing so it's not the tie itself that is interesting. It's what doing those types of things does in terms of constructing a wider stream of praxis. And similarly, it's not laughing per se that is interesting. Indeed, when you read the jokes, they're often not terribly funny. But it's what does laughing construct in relation to these challenging paradoxes that they face. So this brings me to my next point, which is, what is it that you actually want to explain? And there you really need to both be familiar with your case and what you can explain, but also some of you will be enjoying social practice theory, really getting right into reading Bourdieu or reading Shatsky or reading Giddens and loving that. And that's great, because you need to have an understanding of the social practices and how the world works from a social practice ontology in order to understand, our premises in this type of work about how things happening in the moment construct things over time. But at the same time, you need sort of what I'd call a mid-range theory. What is this puzzle that, so you've got an empirical puzzle or phenomena that's going on, and you need to link that to some puzzle in existing theory, and that's strategy theory or organization theory. What's something we don't know about strategic change, or about middle managers' roles, or about strategic planning documents and how they're produced, or about the way people act competitively? You know, that's the theoretical, the mid-range theories that you're aiming for, you know, something to do with people's sense-making or change, that your social practice approach and your empirical data can allow you to come up with something that is theoretically novel for that mid-range theory we're interested in. So you're not trying to contribute to practices, praxis, and practitioners, because you can't contribute to that. That's not the intention of that. That's a sensitizing lens, and you may want to focus on one or the other of those bubbles more, and use a particular social theory to delve into that. But in order to do what? To make a contribution to strategy or organization theory, yeah, not to social theory. Okay, so what are some of the challenges? I can see some questions coming up, and I'll deal with some of those as we get closer to the end. So what are some of the challenges with studying strategy as practice? Well, one of the things is performance anxiety, as I say, as in people tend to say, but we don't have a performance outcome. We can't prove success, or that firms, you know, perform better because of this praxis or that praxis or whatever. But I'd like to say that very few theories can actually do that. So if we think about Porter's 5 forces, which was, was a theory of indeed, rivalry and competitiveness within industries, people did have extensive tests of this theory to understand how much of the variance in firm profitability it can explain. And of course, it was in fact a somewhat predictive theory, as we see with 4 to 18% of overall variance in firm profitability explained through that theory. But if you look at that, I guess what you also see is that's leaving an awful lot that's not explained by that theory. So in other words, we don't need to get hung up for a start on firm profitability as if that was the only important performance outcome that you could explain. But even if it was, no theory can explain, all of the performance differences. So even if you did want to, you don't need to be embarrassed about your theory, because there aren't theories that explain that unequivocally. But more importantly, I think what we're aiming to do is actually not to explain quantitative differences of, because they laughed more or because they do it in this way, their analytic work, they are, quantitatively have an ROE that outperforms the market by whatever over a 2-year period. I mean, that's the wrong question to be asking with these kind of data. We're actually looking for, what are the qualitative differences? What are the shifts in the way people do things, and why do they do it to make that shift? Or why did this strategy start like that and then they changed what the strategy was subtly without even knowing it themselves? What are the qualitative differences? And if we go back to this Chambliss article on the mundanity of excellence, what we see is that quantitative improvements can often mean doing more of the same thing. But qualitative improvements can mean that the actual character or nature of what we're doing or observing people do shifts or changes. And it's in that you find that, aha, that's a theoretical insight. This thing they're doing now is not, in fact, the same as what they were doing before. It's not just more of it the same, it's actually doing something different. And that's what we're looking for, those kinds of outcomes. When do people shift in what they're doing and with what effects? People say that it can't explain large-scale phenomena, that it's just about that micro stuff. I would definitely argue with that. I would agree that our early empirical work in the field, has focused on micro stuff, as in what people were doing inside firms, primarily because we didn't have many theories in strategy in which people had actually looked at that, so we didn't know a lot about it. But that didn't mean it couldn't explain other things, because if we think about the underlying social theories like Bourdieu, like Giddens, like Foucault, these are theories of the way the world works. You can't get much larger scale than the way the world works or how social order is. And so in that sense, these theories can explain large-scale things. Indeed, they can explain why Olympic swimmers are excellent. That's a large-scale thing to explain. I also think that increasingly what we tend to see people saying is that when we only focus on the quantitative indicators and metrics, we will get only one view of large-scale phenomena anyway. But we will also miss a number of other things, and in doing so, we may miss causes of failure. So in that sense, we need to look at how these micro, if we use the word micro, as in these everyday doings and sayings, are actually constructing rather large social phenomena that are consequential for people, such as how markets act. And so some of the work that I've done has been looking at how everyday trading practices done by traders around the world construct a particular market, the reinsurance market, and that's a very important market because it's the market that pays after disasters. And so we need to know how it's constructed and how shifts in practices might actually expose that market to fragility or failure. Okay, so what are the things we've been, I've made a big case for the fact that we can study large-scale things, so that is a criticism of us, but we can go beyond it. Let's look at what we have mostly studied, and it's really worthwhile, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, to look at the Handbook of Strategies Practice, because it's really helpful. It has a number of the different social theories that might be of interest, so it gives you an idea of different social theories that people draw upon, but it also then gives you a series of different empirical phenomena that people focus on and have been able to make conclusions about. So obviously practice, praxis and practitioners is an overarching sensitizing framework. It's not a theory, it's not a lens, it's not something you can actually use to say, I study practices, praxis and practitioners. It's just a sensitizing device, and within that, you might be more interested in the practices of strategic planning or strategy formation, or you might be more interested in the practitioners involved, or you might be interested in how it unfolds as a stream of praxis over time. So you see, you could look at any of these things through one of those lenses. You could be interested in strategy meetings, workshops, strategy tools, the materiality of strategy. We've got special issues on that. You could be interested more in these strategy process type things, like how strategies emerge, how they change, the challenges of implementation, and you could study these from the practices involved, or who are the practitioners and what is it that they do. You could be studying strategy within and across levels of the firm. I've actually done studies in each of these types of areas and phenomena and grounded them in theories about the way, existing strategic management and strategic change theories in order to then use my lens. And I primarily look at practices rather than practitioners. And I try to understand how those practices get knit together in everyday doings and therefore construct the stream of praxis that we see. But I'm not using that language often in my papers. As you can see, I'm then really using that as a sensitizing device to try and explain something we didn't know about theories of strategic planning, or to explain why, if we look at strategic meetings, we'll understand how firms do or do not make change based on what happens in meetings. So you see how we're using it to explain something that is of interest theoretically to the wider field. All right, I want to now talk about underlying premise 2, and then I'll come on to some other things about the questions that you've raised. So underlying premise 2 is that we need to go beyond the micro and the macro. So while I've talked a lot about studying everyday practices, and I use the word micro because it's a convenient word, really, if you read Nicolini's 2013 work or Seidel and Whittington's 2014 work, the point is we're trying to dissolve this barrier between micro and macro as if they were separate things, because that's actually not ontologically consistent with social practice theory. We're actually saying that everyday practices constitute wider phenomena. So, in all those mundane things that I talked about people doing, they are actually constructing organisation, strategy, competition, and so forth. And so it makes no sense to talk about micro as if doing was something separate from the thing that is being done or constructed, because the two are entangled. So we're really interested in how are these wider phenomena, often called macro, like competition or markets, instantiated within the practices of the people. And that's often called micro. But really, that's a false divide, and sometimes it's just a linguistic convenience, particularly maybe when we're dealing with people for whom micro and macro are easier words to understand. But what we're really trying to do is zoom in on incidences of everyday doing, these everyday practices that are often termed micro, and then zooming back out to say why doing it this way makes a difference to the strategy or to how they handle the paradox, or in the case of our Lloyd's paper, how they manage contradictory logics smoothly and seamlessly in their actions as they trade deals. A paper that I think is very useful for you if you're really interested in going to the next stage of this, in terms of an empirical paper, is a paper that I did with Rebecca Bednarek. And in that, we actually do use the word micro, as in we look at how people compete across firms. So we look at the strategizing practices, their competitive practices that you see on this slide, and how those competitive practices construct in the moment either rivalrous ways of competing or relational ways of competing, or sometimes people choose not to compete at all. Okay, they abstain from competing, but on any specific micro competition. So people compete on deals. When we talk about competition, we think, oh, firms competing in markets. But a firm can't compete in a market. It's just a thing. A firm is nothing except what the people do. So really it's people doing things in the name of the firm to make competition happen. And that's what we show. And in this paper, we actually develop a nice scaffolding that might be useful for you, because our practices, which we describe, are the micro, if you like, or the doings and sayings. And then we show how these doings and sayings, if you go to the next page, the next slide, this is our theoretical model, and it might help you provide you with a scaffolding if you want to look at how what people do, these micro actions, construct wider phenomena. And so we actually show how these doings and sayings on specific micro competitions both construct on the top line the actual unfolding competitive arena, how the arena itself is shaped, how many deals are left, how fiercely they are competed, at the same time as, they are influenced by, as people do things, that actually affects what their firm is doing. So it's a kind of scaffolding. It's an ambitious paper, but I'm really proud and pleased about it because it does try to take seriously this issue here of zooming in on what people are doing and zooming out to use that to explain that what they're doing is competing on deals, and that in competing on those deals, they're actually constructing the competitive market within which all deals are traded competitively. So it's possible to do that. You don't have to do that. There's still a lot to be had if we go back in studying these topics. We still don't know a lot about these topics, and there's much more that you can do in your own research to help us understand these features. So I'd encourage you to find a level of analysis that suits you and where you feel it's discrete enough that you can actually come up with something. And some of the critiques, of course, that we've had, and I welcome critiques. You always know when you're getting somewhere, when people notice you enough to criticize what you're not doing well enough. And that's good, because you can either say, yes, that actually is an area that this theory doesn't deal with because it's not relevant. Or you can say, actually, no, you're right. We need to do a little bit more on that. We haven't really, it offers opportunities for us to make further contributions. Largely, there are criticisms that we under-theorize power. And I guess it is true that many of the papers that I read, and indeed that I've written myself, my aim is not understanding power. So you could do that with those data. You don't have to, but some people could take a power angle on this, how practice constructs power relationships within the strategy process. And I think that would be really interesting and of theoretical interest. So it's not essential, these are choices, but I think it would add. It's always a problematic to get to grips with point 2, which is that we're watching things that are emerging, they're becoming. And so you don't know in advance what will happen. And so you are following and trying to make patterns in that which was actually unfolding before your eyes. So that's, a continuous problem for us. And sometimes when we present it in papers, because we're talking about something that we already know happened and we know how it emerged after the fact, it can look a little bit reified by the time you present it. Although when you were there in the field with the actors, of course, it was much more emergent. Some people note that it's performative, so strategy theories actually are performative. They shape how and why practitioners do the things they do. And there's actually a special issue in long-range planning on performativity. And I think there's another one that's in process at the moment in org studies where people are trying to look more at the performative nature of some of our theories. And also we've probably been a little less sensitive to issues to do with the objects or the materialities of practices, and these are some of the critiques. So those are some of the things to think about. We also haven't got a lot yet on strategy as a profession. Richard Whittington has just written some material on that. It's his 4th P, if you like, and he's got a book coming out or has just come out that might be of interest if you're interested in it as a profession. We could still get much more serious, as I said, about materials and materiality. We'd still need to come up with a better so what. So knowing that, what difference does it make? Increasingly, there's an interest in external actors and open strategy as firms are able to open their strategy processes through technology. There's been a special issue on open strategy and long-range planning. There's another one in org studies that there's been a call for papers. So I think that these are areas where we'd like to know more. And of course, we're very much interested to try and get some of these wider phenomena, competition and so forth, or possibly even these other types of outcomes, if you like, that could be studied. So these are options that we could also do more in, keeping in mind that, as I said, we can still do an awful lot in what we have already done because there's a lot more to study there. So I guess my questions are, what does it make you think? Some of you have sent me some questions. I've tried to answer some of those as I go along. I think there's really only one more perhaps, but if you've got any other questions, I've got a couple more minutes if you sent them through. One of the questions is, how could research in emerging countries contribute to the SAP community? What other contexts besides large private organisations could be interesting for SAP? I think that, we could look at, so you've got to remember that context in and of itself is not the contribution. There's got to be something that you're saying. For example, there's been lots of studies in public sector organisations. I myself studied universities. There's been studies in healthcare. There's studies of, smaller sort of emerging firms. So startups, for example, could be interesting because they are extreme examples of emergence. So it's not that it's a startup per se that is interesting. It's that it's interesting because we're very interested in emergence, and a startup is an extreme example of emergence because it doesn't have a plan, it doesn't have resources, it has to actually, all of those have to emerge within the doing. So that would be an interesting context, but you see the point isn't it's an interesting context because it's a startup as opposed to a large private organisation. The point is it's an interesting context because it lets us understand emergence in a more extreme way. So similarly, if you want to look at research in emerging countries, you could look at issues to do with, so maybe emerging countries that have political instability, you could look at how political instability shapes the external strategizing behaviours of actors. I mean, I'm just making an assumption there, but if we thought that that was one of the features of the particular emerging country, and we know that actors have to manage, strategists have to manage their external environment, if you face political instabilities, does it have specific effects on the way you do your external strategizing? Or, one of my PhD students is studying strategizing within very religious contexts where there's a dominant single religion. And it's quite interesting because it gives us a context in which we see how religious practices permeate strategizing practices. And so that it lets us know something about the way strategy is done because of the nature of the context that we would not otherwise have known. And so it's a different context. It's this different context sheds theoretical light on something that we wouldn't have seen if we didn't have this context. So I welcome all of those kinds of studies, very much so. There's 3 other questions. I'm going to read them out and answer them, and then I'm going to have to stop because I'll be a minute or 2 over time. So first of all, are interdependence practices and processes a key future area? I think all of our work looks at interdependent practices and processes. So for example, if you take any of the studies that look, for example, at social practices of interaction or, even sort of laughter or whatever, there's an interdependence between that and what is going on as a process. So It's always been of relevance, and it will continue to be even more so of relevance. But if your particular interest is in interdependence, look for theories where interdependence is a key feature. So it could be things to do with organizational integration and so forth, or it could be things to do with paradox theories, and use your practice lens to shed light because it has a particular view on interdependence. I don't know any studies on phronesis. Sorry about that one. I think, but do a search and you'll find that. I have seen the word, so I know if you do a search on Google or indeed on the SAPN website where we have a bibliography, I'm sure you'll find some stuff. And what do business angels do? I think that business angels could certainly be a field of SAP. When I say a field of SAP, it's not a field because SAP is a field. It could be a topic you could study through a strategy as practice lens. But remember, what do business angels do is an empirical question. It's not a theoretical question. So you'd have to come up with a reason why it's theoretically interesting. We know it's empirically interesting what they do, and therefore to study their practices and their praxis, but you'd have to come up with a theoretical reason. So the key for you, if that's your question, is to understand what's the theoretical contribution you'd make by studying those practices. Okay, so I think I'm going to have to stop there. There are more questions coming in, but we are just 1 minute over time, and we'd like to keep doing more of this work. Let me stop sharing my screen and just show you myself again to say thanks very much for taking this time with me. Sorry we couldn't interact in a more lively way than except through the chat, but I hope it's been helpful and interesting to you to see what I think is important. I know there'll be other seminars in this series and webinars, and you might get some slightly different views from different ones of us and different angles, and all of that will help you develop your own rich picture of what's interesting and important to you. So good luck and happy practicing your strategy as practice research. Bye.